Going to be talking about Guy Ritchie's The Covenant today. So a little under 8 months ago, I first watched this a couple times at least. It blew my mind. Nothing like any film I'd ever seen from Guy Ritchie. Slow, but rich, full of emotion, full of tension. But I think that a lot of the significance of the film is everything that goes unspoken. John Kinley talks about the debt that he owes, and he talks about deals and backing yourself and honoring your word. But there's no point, for instance, where the word covenant is used. And this is probably the first thing that I want to point out about the film. From what I remember researching this like 8 months ago, the film I think was originally going to be called The Interpreter. And Ahmed is one of the two main characters in the film, and he is the interpreter, the Afghan interpreter. Half the film is focused on him and half is focused on the American soldier John Kinley, but it's not that clear cut because Covenant is so much better of a title. It's about their shared bond. And whenever it's about one, it's really about both. Guy Ritchie chose to rename the film from The Interpreter, which was very limited, felt more like it would almost be focused on this one character, to broaden it to the theme of covenant. We see that it gives us an historical context, how it talks about how America withdrew their troops and left a lot of the interpreters and their families to fend for themselves while the Taliban took over Afghanistan all over again. And so there's definitely a heavy political theme in it, but it feels very solemn. It doesn't feel like a film that's trying to lambast or just scream in the face of one political side or the other. It feels almost less political and more like a man looking at another man and saying, you messed up. You broke covenant. You failed. You broke your bond. Your word was your bond and you broke it. And so it feels more timeless, larger than any little political squabble. But there's definitely a larger theme. Politics are involved, but I'm not interested in the politics today. I'm interested in exploring how Guy Ritchie's The Covenant is deeply biblical. And this teaches us a lot about masculinity, a lot about humanity, and a lot about Christianity and God's covenant with us and his pursuit of us and our covenant, our bond of love with each other. There's a lot to it. And I'm going to, in my raw version, I'm going to just rattle off whatever thoughts come to mind and then hope that in post I can streamline it into something that feels like it's got a bit of a thesis to it. But as I was saying, the film was originally, it seems, going to be called The Interpreter, which would have felt a lot more narrow, like we weren't thinking about the bigger picture. But Guy Ritchie wanted to rename it to The Covenant, but there was already a film called The Covenant that came out, 10 plus years ago. And it's, from what I remember, like a zombie film. Just a very over-the-top, very different film. And so Guy Ritchie, I believe that's why he called it, to identify it, Guy Ritchie's The Covenant. He was so on board with renaming this film from The Interpreter to The Covenant that even though a film already existed with that name, he slapped his name on it just to identify it, to hold on to the concept, the theme of the covenant as the central theme of this whole film. Covenant is a very, very Judeo-Christian concept. I'm not saying that it doesn't belong to other cultures, that's people who don't subscribe to the Christian faith, the Jewish faith, that they don't understand what covenant is. Covenant is all throughout humanity and human history and human society. But it is very, very, very pivotal to Christianity. God continually made covenants. He made a covenant with Abraham that he would bless him and he would bless the nations through Abraham's offspring. He made a covenant with Moses that became the Old Covenant based off of the law and these series of sacrifices to atone for their sin, to remind them of their sin, to keep them coming back to the Lord. And that Old Covenant was filled with prophecy and with significance, even in all of the various laws of the Old Covenant that were pointing to, ultimately, to the new covenant that was to be made in Jesus Christ. That's like the ultimate covenant, but we experience the covenantal bonds of word with the people around us all the time. There's a lot of other covenants and bonds that go on the perimeter, but I don't think I'm going to talk about them in this video. I think one of the most significant frameworks that we can set up for understanding this story and benefiting the most from it is identifying the two main characters with David and Jonathan from the Old Testament. 1 Samuel 18. Now it came about when he had finished speaking to Saul that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David. because he loved him as himself. Let's start with John Kinley. Jonathan was the son of Saul, King Saul, the first king of Israel. John Kinley represents Jonathan, the son of Saul. And in this interpretation, in this analysis, I would say that the U.S. is Saul, is the reigning kingdom of Israel. And I would say that the Taliban are the Philistines, who in the Old Testament were doing battle with the nation of Israel. So the Taliban are the Philistines, and the U.S. is Saul and Saul's household, the royal household of Israel, the ones who were in power, coming in, trying to make headway in this more wild, pagan, heathen, idol-worshiping land. No, I'm not applying any of this biblical stuff straight to American politics. I want to look at this on a principle level, on a spiritual level, and on a social interpersonal level. Colonel Vokes. Vokes apparently means people or folk people. And so, to me, again, Vokes is the one who is sending Jonathan out. Vokes is the one who is supporting the actions of the king. Vokes, the people. There's a couple different times where Vokes has an apple, and then Vokes gives an apple to John Kinley. Traditionally, kind of in almost pop culture, the pop culture of religion, we often think of the apple as the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Symbolically, culturally, I think we often associate it. Israel was not meant to have an earthly king. Their king was always meant to be God. And they would have prophets and oracles and people who would speak to them the will and knowledge of God, and they had their priesthood and stuff, but they were not meant to actually have a king like the nations around them. The people of Israel, at the end of the book of Judges, the people demanded that God give them, or Samuel give them, a king so that they could be like the nations around them. So if I'm looking at this symbolically, the people, Colonel Vokes, the people, are giving that responsibility, the knowledge of good and evil, they're giving it to Jonathan, to the household of Saul, entrusting the king to make them safe, to guide them, to make the decisions. And Colonel Vokes says, we did not have this conversation. And he's as out of the picture as possible. And he's telling John, the household of Saul, just go, just make it happen. Let's look at Ahmed As David. Ahmed means highly praised, or one who constantly thanks God. Abdullah means servant of Allah. In this lens would be servant of God. And highly praised, or one who constantly thanks God. David constantly gives thanks to God. And in his Psalms, he said, it is good to, your praise will always be on my lips. And David was highly praised, the best king of Israel ever to live. And he was so prominent and so central in God's plan to eventually bring the Messiah into human history that Jesus is constantly in prophecy and when he is on the earth is referred to as Son of David. Son of David. So David is a Christ type. David is a Christ type. Ahmed is a David type. And as with any type, it's not a perfect one-for-one, but there's stuff that we can learn through meditating on this and analyzing it and turning it over for funsies. In 1 Samuel, David gets chosen from the lineup of his brothers. Ahmed gets chosen out. You see the lineup in the scene. Ahmed gets chosen out from all these prospective interpreters who all have skill. They're all capable, but Ahmed is the chosen one. And Ahmed gets brought to the royal court. He gets brought in among the American military to serve them in that interpreter capacity. There's a point where John comes out to Ahmed when they're at the base, and he asks him what he's doing, and Ahmed says, tightening the fan belt, sir. And it has this servant in the king's household feel. David got brought into the household of Saul, and he fought Goliath. He became a warrior in Saul's household, and he would play his harp to soothe Saul. Way later on, when Ahmed is delivering John out of the hand of the enemy, John Kinley is so battered by his wounds that he's not conscious, but he suffers a lot of pain. And so Ahmed, at one point, he gets some opium from these guys. He feeds him. He shelters him when he's cold. He's always there tending to John. And whenever John starts to, we see these shots and the editing of the audio, it sounds like he's possessed, like he's tormented. The sounds that he's making are edited in such a way that it almost sounds animalistic. And Ahmed soothes him until he calms down again. And that's what David did with Saul. When Saul became tormented by the spirit after he had turned his back on God and God took his favor from him, Saul began to be tormented by this spirit, and he would have these times of rage. And so David was brought in with his skill in the harp and in singing, and he would play his harp and it would soothe Saul. And so another little piece is that Ahmed, David, plays a soothing role to the house of Saul. There's a lot of points early on where Ahmed doesn't have a gun while everyone else does, and that makes me think of David facing Goliath with just his 5 smooth stones, and he doesn't take Saul's armor and gear, the American weapons. He just goes and he just takes his shepherd's accoutrements. There's a point where John Kinley says to Ahmed early on, "You're here to translate." And Ahmed says, "Actually, I'm here to interpret." Prophets play this interpretive role, and David has this spirit of prophecy about him in Scripture. He speaks and interprets the heart of God for the people. There's a point where they're walking down a street and they're about to go and check out this building. Ahmed says not to go in there. He says he knows what goes on behind the doors. And John Kinley says, the oracle doth speak. David was an oracle of God. So even though John Kinley is saying this tongue-in-cheek, I see another instance where David, Ahmed, plays this Davidic role of the oracle, the soother, the pursuer and deliverer of those in the household of Saul. Ahmed becomes a folk hero. The Taliban become furious that Ahmed has outwitted them. John Kinley and Ahmed already were escaping their grasp after they had destroyed the rest of their unit. John and Ahmed continued to survive. They, and especially Ahmed, became a folk hero in that region. Like Ahmed was on the top 10 most wanted list of the Taliban. There's a point where David is coming in when he's serving in Saul's household, and they're coming back from a battle or from war, and the people in the streets are singing this song, and it says, Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. And so David did become a folk legend. And go with me on this. David eventually ends up on the run from Saul. Saul gets so jealous, so afraid that David will usurp him, that Saul begins to hunt David, and David is on the run. And we see throughout this film, David and Jonathan being on the run. And then when Jonathan is taken back to the royal courts, when John Kinley returns back to America, David, Ahmed, is on the run with his family. And he's on the run from the Taliban. But in this light, I would say that the Taliban, if not now representing the house of Saul, are at least implicitly endorsed by the house of Saul, by the Americans, because the Americans are not seeking to deliver David and seeking to deliver Ahmed. And so Ahmed is on the run, David is on the run, and during all this time, he is a folk hero. People rise up to support him. People rise up to support Ahmed, to get him from one hiding place to the next, to let him know when he's being pursued. And Ahmed always just manages to escape and survive. And that same thing happens with David. 2 different times, Saul gets super close to David, but he escapes Saul's grasp each time. His reputation continues to grow even as he's on the run. So that's Ahmed. John Kinley is Jonathan. And they have this love for each other. About an hour and a half in, Ahmed's brother tells John, do you know what your name means in our language? It means my dear or my love. There is this intimacy shared between them that they never explicitly say to each other. But it's like when David says your love is better than that of a woman. There is a special, special bond between them. It's like untouchable. It's right after that he says, my brother told me about your beautiful blue eyes. And then he says that Ahmed's son also had blue eyes. There is a sense of romance on a larger scale, not a sexual level, but a pursuit and a love between these 2 men that feels very much like David and Jonathan. In 1 Samuel 16:12, it says, so he sent and brought him in. Now David was ruddy with beautiful eyes and a handsome appearance. David had beautiful eyes. Ahmed's brother tells John that Ahmed talked about Jonathan's beautiful eyes. Why? Because Ahmed's brother said that they reminded him of Ahmed's son, whom the Taliban had killed. So if Ahmed's son had beautiful eyes, then making a loose connection, Ahmed had beautiful eyes, David has beautiful eyes. Ahmed saw his likeness the likeness of his son in John Kinley. So David and Jonathan's bond is something deeper than just two dudes up here who have a respect for each other. There was something spiritual. There was a connection in the Lord that had gone on here. And so their covenant ultimately represents Ahmed and John's covenant. Ahmed sees his son in John. So Ahmed is a David type. David is a Christ type. Christ is the image and radiance of the glory of God and the exact representation of his nature. So God sees his son in us. God sees his son in us. There's a couple other ways that there's a few other ways that David and Jonathan, Ahmed and John, are shown as one person. One, both of them are mechanics. When John goes back home, we see that he works in an auto shop. And we hear in the beginning, Ahmed says that he was a mechanic before this whole interpreter business came up. And then when John finds Ahmed later in the film, Ahmed is back to working on a car. They share a profession already. Despite coming from two totally different worlds, they are one in their profession. Then we see that when John Kinley is wounded and Ahmed has to bring him safely back to base, Ahmed puts on the local garb and John is still wearing his American soldier's getup. Then when John comes back to get Ahmed, John is now wearing the clothing of the locals. And Ahmed is dressed much more like a typical American, wearing a jacket and jeans or some sort of trousers and shoes. And so it's like they share each other's identity. There's at one point and another, they have this symmetry where one is dressed as the other's culture and vice versa. Then we have this beautiful repetition of these dolly-in shots where every time this happens, except for the one time when John Kinley is separated geographically from Ahmed, we see the camera closing in on John and we cut with the camera closing in on Ahmed. And then every time, eventually, the camera pulls back from John, pulls back from Ahmed. And to me, that feels like each time they're being knit together. They're sharing some sort of intense interaction, whether they're opposing each other or whether they're sharing this kind of unspoken knowledge or this thought or sense or feeling. And then it pulls away again. And each time it's a different subtext of why we're getting closer, but it's always mirrored. It's always symmetrical. We're getting both of them drawing close, but then it goes back away. And so we have this repetition of being knit together, being drawn to each other, and this ebb and flow of this unresolved covenant, this covenant that has not been fulfilled yet, this deal, this bond that has not been satisfied yet. And it won't be satisfied fully until the final moments of the film. This bond is further underscored when we finally see John Kinley interacting with his wife and Ahmed interacting with his wife. These scenes come back to back. The first time in the film that we see them, we see John Kinley talking with his wife and kids on a computer screen, like virtually having a little chat. All that they talk about once the kids leave is how's the business doing? How are the books? And it's like, yeah, business is good, books are good. And he's like, no, you don't need me. And then they're like, I love you too. And that's it. It's almost exclusively business. That's the entire scene. After all this intimacy, all these conversations and dialogues and all this life being lived, it's as if that relationship is almost non-existent compared to the reality over here in this war-torn land where they have nothing but each other. And then we see Ahmed with his wife and new baby. I think she's pregnant at the time. And again, he takes good care of her, like he's loving to her and very tender, and she loves him. It's very clear. But it's, again, very shop talk, very talking about survival and the next thing they need to do. There's obviously a love and a tenderness and a bond between these husbands and wives, but there's so much reality being shared between these men in this war-torn land. This bond between them is revealing something about God's covenant with us. Jesus with us, his friends. Jesus said, greater love has no man than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. And he says, you are my friends. I have revealed these things to you, and if you abide in my words, you are my friends, and I will lay down my life for you. So ultimately, what we see in David and Jonathan's covenant relationship and in Jesus's covenant relationship with us is this. It's better than any other kind of human dynamic and relationship we could have. So we're seeing Jesus's covenant relationship with us through David and Jonathan, through John and Ahmed. And that's why in this context, all these other relationships that are normally so powerful pale in comparison to this, because this is the central theme, is this mysterious covenantal bond on a divine level between man and God. And by man, I mean man, woman, and child, humanity. The film is focused on this covenant commitment between these two men. It's on a larger scale representing, I think Guy Ritchie means what America should have done, that they should have gone in and rescued all these people who had given their lives for the Americans. Now the Americans should go in and rescue and pay their debts and bring those people out of danger and destruction. And then their covenant would have been fulfilled, which America failed to do due to our leadership. But there are these jokes that I think continue to underscore. They show the aspects of when David said your love is better than that of any woman. We see these jokes peppered throughout the script. John jokes with Declan, like trying to flirt with him to get information out of him. John is joking with Jizzy in the Hummer, where they're talking about, this is a nice place, we could settle down, we could build a homestead here, and we could get some animals. And later on, and I think I'm missing one or two potentially, but in the end, when John Kinley comes and finds Ahmed says something like, I like your clothes, or something like that. And then John says, I like what you've done with your hair. And both of those feel very much like a couple getting back together and trying to like repair this relationship and give some timid compliments, and like lovers kind of skirting around each other. And so there are these jokes, and yet there's a purity to it all. Like there's an acknowledgement that we have a special bond, and yet the true nature of the bond is so serious. It's so true that the true nature will never explicitly be spoken. And that is something special to man. It is any human being can embody this, but it's something special to men, that they often don't speak that deepest kernel, that deepest core. And so we see them flirting around the topic with all these jokes, implying this bond that they have, being casual about it, and making light of this very heavy responsibility that they have to take care of each other. And it belies that deeper commitment, that covenant to one another. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered, and Saul set him over the men of war. And it was pleasing in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Jonathan makes David royal. He covers him with his royalty. In the film, John Kinley goes back to Afghanistan to bring Ahmed into the royal house, to America, where he will be safe with his family. He comes to lay his royal vestments over Ahmed and bring him safely home. There are multiple references to dogs in the film. A dog in that culture means an unfaithful man, unfaithful or faithless man. Leaving out all the specific references to dogs, there's two different times where John Kinley basically says to Ahmed, a lot of dogs around here. And the second time he says it is after he has braved all the threats of the Taliban to find his way back to Ahmed to bring him to America with his family, as the government had originally promised Ahmed. The house of Saul had originally promised David. There's a proverb that says, many a man proclaims his own steadfast love, but a faithful man who can find? So again, faithfulness, being faithful to your covenant bond, is central in this film. And so John Kinley repeats this exact line, implying a lot of faithless people around here. It's underscoring that Ahmed was faithful, and it's implying like, look, I came back for you. I am proving through action my faithfulness to you. Ahmed wears a mask, pulls a cloth up over his mouth and covers his mouth for most of the film, until this moment where he is exposed with John and they are like one, fighting for each other. All the way up before that, we see him covering his mouth, covering his words, the word of his bond, covering the thing that will reveal who he truly is. the word and how he aligns with it. And that makes me think about 2 Corinthians 3 with Christ, his glory being unveiled to those. When they turn to Christ, the old covenant is unveiled and we see the glory of Christ in the old covenant. We see and understand his words like never before. He veils his mouth. His mouth is his identifier rather than like his face, it's his mouth. There's a beautiful imagery. Again, thinking of Ahmed as a David type, David as a Christ type. The entire sequence when Ahmed is trying to cart John to safety back to the base. I got to leave out a lot because I'm already short on time. But there's a part where he's pushing John Kinley up this huge hill in the blazing sun. And it feels very much to me like Jesus bearing the cross to the top of Golgotha to sacrifice himself for us. It's incredibly moving. And we see him sitting down there sweating. And it feels like Jesus in Gethsemane sweating blood as he knows that he still has this distance left to go to carry humanity to salvation. If we look at Ahmed as a Christ type, then we could look at John or Jonathan as a type of humanity where we are being carried by Jesus to deliverance, in which case we look at how useless John was when he was dead in his trespasses and sins, as it were. When John says, I should be in that hole, that's like humanity saying, I should have died the death that Jesus died, but he died it for me. He was unable to save himself. And so the Christ type brought him through so much toil and struggle and suffering. He brought him to a place of safety where ultimately, as John Kinley's wife said, you will come back alive. You will live. You will not die. And John Kinley, spoilers, survives at the end of the film and he lives. And so does Ahmed. Guy Ritchie's The Covenant ends with an image of them in this plane getting transported to safety. And the lights go red in the plane. Christ's blood, the atoning blood that satisfies the covenant. Jesus said on the cross, it is finished. And when Jonathan looks at David, when John looks at Ahmed, Ahmed nods briefly. And at that point, John is released from his bond, from what he owed. And he tilts his head back and closes his eyes. And it looks very much like an image of Christ on the cross as he yields up his spirit. And he has this white light or red light and deep shadow on his face. And it fades, and then it says covenant, a bond, a pledge, a commitment. And that text comes up over this red saturated, we've never seen coloring like this in the whole film, but we see the end of the covenant, the covenant, the fulfillment of the covenant. We see John tilting his head back, my dear, my love, the bond is fulfilled, the covenant is fulfilled, covered in the blood of Christ, and he can now rest. And it says in the Old Testament that God will give rest on every side to Israel through this covenant he made with them. And in the New Testament, it says that we have our Sabbath rest in Christ, that now we have rest from the enemies of our soul, the enemies of our spirit. We have rest on every side in Christ. Even though we will still face struggle and life will go on, and on this side of eternity, we have rest and we are guaranteed eternal rest where we are at ease. And even though we're living forward and exploring and delighting ourselves in abundance, there is peace in the midst of it all rather than turmoil and struggle. And so we see rest as the fulfillment of an honored covenant, and it is bathed in the blood of Christ. I got to go and make dinner. I could go on, but for now, all I'll say is ad vitam et gloriam Dei. God bless. Nice.